Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Victoria, and as one of the fellows for the Robert Redford Conservancy, I'm excited that you've all come to join us today for this talk. But before I proceed with introductions, I also would like us to all recognize that we are on Tongva land. So, today, I have the honor of introducing David Pellow to speak with us today about critical environmental justice. Pellow is the Dehlsen and Department Chair of Environmental Studies and Director of the Global Environmental Project at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Pellow specializes in the fields of environmental justice studies, race and ethnic studies, social change, and social movements. Throughout his career, Pellow has published widely on environmental justice issues in communities of color in the U.S. and across the globe. Some of his works include Resisting Global Toxics, Transnational Movements for Environmental Justice, and Garbage Wars, The Struggle for Environmental Justice in Chicago. In 2017, Pellow released his book, What is Critical Environmental Justice?, which provides a framework that illuminates the interconnectedness of environmental justice to concepts such as the U.S. prison industrial complex and the Israel-Palestine conflict. Pellow has served on organizational boards aimed at improving the living and working environments for people of color, immigrants, indigenous folks, and working-class communities. Such organizations include the Global Action Research Center, Center for Urban Transformation, Santa Clara Center for Occupational Safety and Health, Global Response, Greenpeace USA, and International Rivers. With that being said, I would like to invite Professor David Pellow to the stage to further discuss the framework of critical environmental analysis. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Tori, and thank you, Dr. Sarati, for the gracious invitation to the Robert Redford Conservancy and to all of the folks, the fellows, the trustees, President Melvin Oliver, all the wonderful community of supporters here. I want to echo what was just said, what Tori just said in terms of a land acknowledgement, because that's super important. And by first saying that I bring you greetings from occupied traditional indigenous Chumash territory, also known as Santa Barbara. And we are indeed on Tongva indigenous lands. And so those of us who are not Tongva, we can think of ourselves as either invaders or guests. I'd like to think of myself as the latter. And so I will attempt to behave accordingly. And in addition to land acknowledgements, I want to acknowledge that, as many indigenous folks have pointed out, that's a really important first step, but there are many things that institutions can do to go beyond just making a verbal land acknowledgement. And so I want to acknowledge that Pitzer has been doing work on decolonization, and I want to salute you for that. I'm a huge fan of Pitzer College, so much so that my son and my money go to this wonderful institution. And I also allowed my former boss, who was our executive dean, to become your college president. This is Melvin Oliver, who's also a good friend of my family. And so it's a pleasure to be here today. So I'm going to be talking about critical environmental justice, and here's an outline of the talk. I'm going to, not surprisingly, begin with a discussion of Sertler colonialism, because that, for me, is, if not the foundation, it's certainly part of, an important part of the foundation of environmental justice studies. We'll talk a bit about that literature, and then talk about this movement among scholars to push that literature, that scholarship in new directions. That's what we do as scholars, right? We wake up one morning and say, where can I see holes, gaps, problematic discussions that need to be pushed in more exciting directions, and that's where I'm coming from. And I'm going to focus on a case that I've been working on for about 4 years, the U.S. prison and jail system, and then I'll have some concluding thoughts. So let's jump right into it. Sertler colonialism, a good colleague of mine, Kyle Powys-White, who is not only a philosopher, but he's an enrolled citizen of the Potawatomi Nation. So he's an indigenous studies scholar and an indigenous person, indigenous leader. And he defines Sertler colonialism in a really long way, but I've distilled it here. It's essentially the occupation, the control of peoples, of land, of water, plants, animals, aerial space, very important, and ecosystems by another society. You're being occupied by another society. But this isn't just about one people occupying another people. It's a multi-species occupation. This is a social and environmental reality. And that brings me to a second point that Kyle Powis-White makes, which is that settler colonialism, wherever we find it, and certainly the United States is a very good example of that, is itself a form of environmental injustice. Because the invasion of these lands that we now call the United States made it very difficult, explicitly made it very difficult. It undermined indigenous peoples' ability to practice their economies, their cultures, their life ways, ceremony to survive, right? By controlling land, by controlling flora and fauna. Many of you have no doubt seen that famous photo of tons of buffalo skulls, bison skulls piled up in a field in the 19th century. The US federal government went on an extermination campaign of indigenous Plains Indians. And one way to do that was to go after the buffalo, go after the bison, one of their primary protein sources. So this is a very good example of that. Settler colonialism, though, might be something that you think only involves indigenous peoples directly. But it is in fact a framework that undergirds all environmental justice struggles, certainly in the United States, because all environmental justice struggles ultimately turn on or impact in some consequential way land and other ecological wealth that are entangled with histories of conquest. And I get this idea, this isn't just me, but Indigenous studies scholars like Dina Gilio-Whitaker, Tracy Bryn Voiles, Audra Simpson, Andrea Smith, many others, Kim Tallbear, Kyle Powis-White himself, that all struggles for environmental justice can be linked to this foundation of settler colonialism. So it's not something we can actually ignore or get away with. So moving into this connection to the prison system, I want to impress upon you the idea that settler colonialism is a core foundation of the US prison system via the process of human enslavement, human caging. I have in the parentheses here referring to those extermination campaigns that the US federal government and we saw in state governments like in California directed at what were called hostiles, indigenous peoples who committed the heinous act of trying to resist genocide, committed the crime of daring to believe that they could be living in a free society, free of colonization and conquest. They were deemed troublemakers, and so we erected concentration camps, many of which are still around to this day. And so that was absolutely foundational to making settler colonialism possible, human caging. And by the way, human caging in this particular area, the greater Los Angeles area, if you've read Kelly Lytle Hernandez's recent book, City of Inmates, she talks about how the Tongva people had no history of human caging until the Spanish Empire came along, until the Mexican government came along, until the US Anglo-American Empire came along. And then they had plenty of experience with imprisonment and human caging. So settler colonialism is the core foundation of the US prison system. Human enslavement, which is what imprisonment is an example, a particularly troubling example of environmental injustice for two reasons. First, we are taking vulnerable and marginal populations and subjecting them to the brutality, the torturous reality of immobilization and of neutralization that is human enslavement, that is caging, thus producing extraordinary spikes in individual and collective health risks. Real public health risks are the result of being caged. We can take a look at people before they go into prison, once they get into prison, once they leave prison, and you see dramatic differences in people's health. But it's also human enslavement, human caging, imprisonment is also an example of environmental justice or injustice because it also requires the simultaneous subjugation of non-human natures, entire ecosystems, water, flora, fauna, to construct and maintain the prison system. So if settler colonialism is a core foundation of the prison system, if the prison system is an example of environmental injustice, then I want to impress upon you then, by the transitive property, that environmental injustice is core, is a part of this nation's foundation, part of this nation's core. And what I really want to get at for that with that point is that the reformist, the sort of environmentalist light approach to addressing environmental justice isn't going to be terribly effective. It will be seriously limited if we don't take approaches that address settler colonialism, and if we don't take approaches that actually exceed the structure of the US government. And so I'm actually advocating that we take seriously the idea of abolition, of prisons, and decolonization. And again, I want to salute folks on this campus for doing that work. Now, all of us are familiar, no doubt, with the DAPL struggle, the Dakota Access Pipeline that was rerouted from mostly white town in the upper Midwest to the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation, that indigenous community. This is an 1,100-mile long pipeline bringing crude oil from and through the Dakotas to a refinery in Illinois and then points in many other directions. This was an amazing mobilization that began in 2016, where indigenous folks and their allies from all around the world really came together to say no to environmental racism, no to environmental injustice, and yes to indigenous rights, yes to indigenous sovereignty and climate and environmental justice. And while we may have lost that battle, in some ways, the more important work was the message and building this movement of allyship, of solidarity for indigenous rights and sovereignty. And that continues to gain strength. So I'm an academic, and so I've got to talk about studies and literature, and I won't take too much time on that. But I do want to point out that the field, or the subfield in which I operate, environmental justice studies, has been around for quite a while, at least in the United States. Going back at least as far as the early 1970s, moving into the 80s, the 90s, this field today is literally, there are just thousands upon thousands of studies that make up this literature, showing that there is solid empirical evidence of a spatial correlation between race, class, immigration status, and other social categories, and exposure to a whole host of environmental threats, of public health risks, of public health threats. This thesis also, of course, extends to climate change and what we call climate injustices. This, of course, is an interdisciplinary setting, an extraordinarily well-regarded liberal arts college, and so it won't come as a surprise to you that this is a field that may have begun in economics and in the social sciences, but some of the most exciting work that we're seeing in environmental justice studies today are in the interdisciplinary fields of the humanities and indigenous studies, just to name a couple. We're also very, very much interested in looking at a variety of categories of difference, looking at the fact that indigenous communities and the Dakota Access Pipeline struggle was one such example. Communities of color, low-income communities, immigrant communities are targeted for environmental injustices. This doesn't just happen. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. And we are, as a body of literature, very much interested in not just the doom and gloom, but what are some of the positive transformational responses to that reality? And that's the grassroots environmental justice movement. So we're very much focused on that. So we got this thing called critical environmental justice, which was not my idea. A number of scholars have been promoting this concept going back at least since 2005. And again, like any field, we're saying, okay, what are we missing? What are we not doing enough of in this literature on environmental justice? So we've come up with these 4 pillars, these 4 dimensions that we need to push a little harder on. And the first starts with various categories of difference. I've mentioned to you that, of course, we have racial injustices, we have class injustices in terms of where environmental threats are found in the United States. This field has focused and written the book, chapter and verse, that where we find low-income communities, where we find communities of color, we are more than likely going to find environmental threats. People who are already marginalized economically and by dint of their racial background are going to be further threatened or have a higher probability of being further threatened by public health and environmental risks. But that's not good enough. We need to go beyond race and class. And so the first pillar of critical environmental justice is saying, let's keep that going, but let's be deeply intersectional and include gender analyses of sexuality, looking at disability and age, and even species. Let's cross that human-species divide to ask how all of these categories really work together to produce both injustices and possibilities for justice. It's also the case that much of the literature often looks at a single scale. Let's look at this community here, this neighborhood here, this country here. But environmental injustices are not experienced at one scale. So we advocate for multi-scalar analyses and responses to environmental injustice, from the body, the micro scale, to the global, the macro. But we're also interested not just in terms of geography and space, but we're also interested in temporality. How does history live on to this day and shape environmental justice struggles? And then questioning state-centric analysis. This for me is very important because this is a field where some of the most exciting work is focused on policy mechanisms, but too much of the field assumes that the state, that is governmental apparatuses, are going to be the places where we're going to rely on the solutions. This is where the resolutions to environmental justice struggles exists, and I think we need a little bit more creative thinking, because many scholars are now saying, you know what, if you're asking the same institutions who perpetrated the problem to solve the problem, there's a bit of a disconnect in terms of logic there. We can work with and through governments, but we also need to think more creatively than that. Fourth and finally, I have taken on the task of bringing a moral, an ethical, and a normative imperative to this work. Because one of the things that is most important to understand, and it shouldn't surprise you, is that one of the things driving environmental injustice, one of the things driving the deliberate targeting of indigenous communities and communities of color for life-threatening hazards, is this ideology, this notion that some people matter more than others. And so this is the logic of domination, the logic of expendability. And so we say no to that. We push back. And I've heard many youth climate justice activists, journalists like Naomi Klein and others saying, to change everything, we need everyone. And so this is what indispensability is about. We need everybody. We're all in this together if we're going to have a just and resilient collective future. So that's a snapshot of what critical environmental justice looks like. Let me talk about how I want to apply that. So the Prison Environmental Justice Project is some work that I've been doing with undergrads at my institution for 4 years. And we are been investigating the relationship between environmental justice threats and the carceral system in the United States, using several methods. We're using archival methods, content analyses, participant observation. We're traveling to conferences, meeting with scholars, advocates, policymakers, prisoners or formerly incarcerated people who are working on this issue. It is also this last term here, scholar activist. Some might call that activist scholar. The point there is that we're not just sort of gathering information and documenting these relationships. We're interested in making social change and improving people's lives and improving the environment. I started this project not just with a group of students, but with a group of advocates called the Prison Ecology Project. This is a group of people who themselves are running what is called the Campaign to Fight Toxic Prisons. And they are running campaigns around the country to try to clean up prisons that have water contamination, for example, mold contamination, food contamination, but to also shut down prisons that are repeat offenders of environmental injustices, and to prevent the construction of prisons that would further imperil the lives of the incarcerated and the surrounding ecosystems. So I am thoroughly, deeply invested in opposing and challenging the prison industrial complex in this country, because it is inherently violent and frankly, morally evil. So, if you ask my opinion, I'll give it to you. The first pillar of critical environmental justice, let's talk about expanding these social categories. This is possibly the single greatest placard I've ever seen at a protest, and I'm just gonna have to vocalize it because I love how it sounds. The whole system, the whole damn system is racist as hell. Now, anyone who disagrees with that, I'm happy to have a conversation with you after you get educated. A vast majority of people in the prison system in the United States are non-white. They are people of color. We have seen an increase, a 700% increase in people incarcerated in this beast since 1970. We've got 25% of the world's prisoners on planet Earth, and only 5% of the population in the United States compared to planet Earth. We incarcerate more people per capita than any other nation. Lorna Rhodes, who's an anthropologist, says, the prison system in the United States is like a second nation. If you added up everybody, all 2.5 million people in this system, it would be the fourth largest city in the United States. And again, vast majority of folks in the system, people of color. I am proud to state that the United States jails and imprisons more women than any other country on planet Earth. We are a patriarchy, if there ever was one. Women are the fastest growing population of incarcerated persons in the United States, no end in sight. Immigrants. Okay, so I've talked about race, talked about gender. Let's talk about nationality, citizenship. This is a photo of the Northwest Detention Center in the Seattle-Tacoma area. This place is operated by the largest private prison operator, the GEO Group, and it houses 1,500 human beings whose only crime was fleeing their country to find a better life, oftentimes doing so in the wake of climate change. They have seen a number of hunger strikes, a number of acts of resistance at this prison, people protesting the conditions of their confinement. Oh, and a footnote, this prison is actually smack dab on top of and next to a federally designated toxic Superfund site. Super hazardous, super toxic. So the workers, the prisoners are not taking this lightly, but they also have help from allies on the outside. And this is where you and I come in. The Northwest Detention Center Resistance Project, a group of free people on the outside who are literally putting their bodies in the way of vans and trucks that are taking these human beings out of this prison and trying to take them to SeaTac Airport to deport them, trying to slow down that machinery of nativism, racism, and violence, and also drawing attention to the fact that many of these folks have fled regions of the world where climate disruption has occurred. So this is an environmental justice issue. Continuing with the story of immigration, we can see one of the largest immigrant prisons in the country is the Carnes family residential or detention center. This is based in Texas in what is called the Eagle Ford Shale. This is in the drilling epicenter of the Eagle Ford Shale, a 20-county region that has hydraulic fracturing, which many of you understand this super violent, very, very problematic process that has produced oil well blowouts, residential evacuations, and according to a study done by Northeastern Illinois University, 75% of the free residents in this area complain about foul odors and toxic waters. Well, guess what it's like inside this prison that gets its water from that same water system? They are heavily chlorinating the water to mask the smell and the taste of hydrocarbons, and the resistance continues. These folks, mothers and children, have been going on strike and to draw attention to this issue. Now, I mentioned there are children in these facilities. If you've been paying attention to the news, the Trump regime's family separation policy and practice continues. You may be aware that many of these facilities, these immigrant prisons, are understaffed, not enough people to address the needs of the folks inside. I have an idea. Maybe they shouldn't be inside in the first place. But in order to pacify these young children, a whole alphabet soup, a whole cocktail of chemicals have been injected into these children without consent of their parents or the children, which have had a number of side effects: depression, rapid weight gain, feelings of emptiness, and betrayal. Betrayal. Can you imagine? So we've talked about race, we've talked about gender, we've talked about immigration status. Let's talk about disability. Human Rights Watch did a report in 2015 about an extraordinarily disturbing epidemic of violence in our carceral system, where many people with mental disabilities who are differently abled are the subjects of pain compliance and what I call chemical warfare, where they're actually being sprayed with chemical sprays, OC spray, pepper spray, these things in order to bring them in compliance. When they're given an order and they're not responding the way a quote-unquote normal person would respond, instead of working with them and understanding their struggles, they are being literally poisoned. Chemical sprays like OC and pepper spray can lead to asphyxiation, eye irritation, death, etc. So this is a major issue. So we're moving from disability then to gender and sexuality, gender identity. Queer and trans prisoners are people who are living in hell in the prison system. They are on a daily basis, according to the United Nations Special Rapporteur, being targeted because of their sexuality, because of their identity, because of their gender identities, by the prison system, by wardens, by corrections officers, and by fellow prisoners. So this is a category that makes a lot of sense to focus on, because this is a site of violence. I'm also a big fan of a number of advocacy organizations doing work with LGBTQ folks out there, like the group Black and Pink, Check them out if you're not aware of them. Black and Pink does advocacy work for prisoners who are LGBTQ and HIV positive. Pen Pals, it's writing program, prisoner support program, and they also do court support. So that's an environmental justice issue as well. Let's talk about age. In the state of Oregon in February of 2017, the Oregon Youth Authority, which is the state government agency in charge of the youth prison system, decided that the water contamination scandal that was rocking many cities in that state might also apply to the prison system, the youth prison system. There are 11 youth prisons in the state of Oregon. 9 of them, according to this study, had off-the-charts levels of copper and lead poisoning in the water that children in these prisons were drinking. So youth matters, and they aren't actually counted in those figures that you usually see about the 2.3 or whatever it is millions of people incarcerated in the United States. So they really are off the map. They're also resisting this as well. So I've talked about a number of social categories on this first pillar of critical environmental justice. I haven't talked about species. I want to do that now. This is an amazing story, in my opinion. Letcher County, Kentucky. $510 billion federal penitentiary proposal. Trump and his boys personally invested in this. This would have been the largest federal prison proposal in the United States history. Letcher County, Kentucky. If you look over here, so yeah, there's the money there. This is the site where that prison would be located. Anybody have any idea what's going on at that site? Help me out. Any ideas? A mine, a coal mine, exactly. Not just another mine, not just a coal mine, but mountaintop removal mining, right? So for the Trump supporters in the world who think, oh, let's bring back the coal industry, you might want to have a conversation with the coal industry who's not terribly interested in creating jobs, because you don't create but a handful of jobs when your method of getting at the coal seams is dynamiting an entire mountain range. You create ecological and social havoc. So this mountain, gone. The coal, gone. Jobs, sorry, Trump, they're gone. Talk to the boys in the coal industry. They're the ones who took those jobs away. So the solution, let's put a $510 billion prison there. Let's lock up some poor folks, some black and brown folks. And let's also ignore the fact that that prison would not only be a multi-layered form of environmental injustice, just because that is already an environmental injustice, but there are communities of color and low-income communities nearby who would be impacted by this. And then this little critter here, the Indiana bat, close cousin of the gray bat, would also be consequentially impacted. Why does that matter? Other than the fact that I'm an animal lover, because they are an endangered species suffering from white nose syndrome, which even the best biologists in this country have not wrapped their head around what the causes are of that and what we can do about it. So just this June, a group of 21 prisoners from around the country mobilized from within the belly of the beast, within the bowels of prison systems, contacted each other, and anti-prison activists and environmental justice activists developed a coalition and mobilized against this prison because they said that the environmental impact statement didn't sufficiently address all of those impacts that I just talked about. Well, in July, the Federal Bureau of Prisons agreed, and they withdrew the proposal. That prison was never and will never be built. An enormous victory for environmental justice and prisoners' rights. So that's the first pillar. Let's talk about the second pillar. Second pillar of looking at multi-scalar analyses. Let's talk about micro-analyses. Trigger warning comes a bit late. I should have done that in the beginning. Anyone whom I've talked to who has served time, is serving time, or is a loved one of somebody serving time, or anyone who is an attorney advocating for somebody who has served time, has said, you know what? Liberals and conservatives all go to bed at night believing a myth, and that is that we can somehow reform and dramatically reduce sexual violence in the prison system. Good luck with that. No one has been able to do that yet. Sexual violence is endemic to imprisonment. It comes with the territory. Why am I talking about that? Because some of the most exciting scholarship in the environmental humanities has actually said that sexual violence and any form of assault on the human body can now be thought of as an environmental issue, an environmental injustice. Because if we think about the environment, and this is the single greatest contribution of the environmental justice field, as not just the land, the air, the water, the beautiful marine life out there, but also as human beings, and human bodies are inseparable from the environment. We are part of the environment. We are the environment. then any assault on our body is also an assault on the environment. Just as an assault on our life support systems, the environment, the ecosystems out there is an assault on us. So this is an exciting area of scholarship that understands the intersections between gender, violence, and environmental politics really go much deeper than we thought before. Food injustices, hey, I have yet to see meet a prisoner who has said that the food on the inside in the big house was edible. It is notorious for being rodent and roach infested, low quality, poor nutrients. This is an environmental injustice. It is a food injustice because literally people are putting very, very toxic substances into their bodies because they have no choice. It's also linked, of course, to the broader industrial agricultural system that is perpetrating environmental and climate injustices around the world from where that food comes from. But prisoners are not taking this lightly or passively. Maricopa County, Arizona, jail inmates there just a couple of years ago had a 3-day hunger strike, 2017, protesting poor quality food. At that same prison system, years before that, we got a landmark ruling, apparently we still need to work on because we're still fighting this, where a federal judge said both the food problems and the extreme heat in Arizona jails and prisons, and that one in particular, are actually unconstitutional, right? So again, prisoners are not passive recipients of these forms of environmental injustice. I want to impress that upon you. I mentioned this term chemical warfare, and I am not engaging in hyperbole. I decided to do what any good student would do, and I looked on dictionary.com, and the definition of chemical warfare is right there in black and white. The use of chemical agents as a weapon of war or terror. Again, whether it's disabled, mentally disabled prisoners who are being attacked with pepper spray, or Black and brown and low-income prisoners in the Holmesburg prison in Pennsylvania who were literally being injected with dioxin, the single most toxic substance known to science and a key ingredient in that defoliant known as Agent Orange. This was a series of rather disappointing and unfortunate experiments led by one Dr. Albert Kligman at the University of Pennsylvania, who for decades was exposing prisoners to this substance of dioxin on behalf not only of the University of Pennsylvania, but on behalf of Dow Chemical, Monsanto, and the US military, causing untold suffering and harm, some of which was documented in the infamous book Acres of Skin. Now, as I said, prisoner resistance is ubiquitous. So Leotis Jones was one of those targets, one of the survivors of those sick experiments. He served his time, he lived through it, he survived, and he is director for many years of this group called Community Assistance for Prisoners. When he got out of the big house, he promptly launched a lawsuit against the city of Philadelphia, the University of Pennsylvania, and Monsanto and Dr. Kligman himself for restitution and reparations. Continuing with multi-scale analyses, let's go a bit higher, talk about macro-scale analyses. People are talking about climate change. I want more people to be connecting climate change to extreme weather events that affect prisons. This is FCI Beaumont, Federal Correctional Institution, Beaumont, Texas. Beaumont, Texas, which in 2017, when Hurricane Harvey hit, dropped 35 inches of water on that community in a matter of moments. This is a community with a prison. The prison warden said, "Peace, I'm out. Y'all are on lockdown. We will not evacuate you. Good luck. Goodbye." The prisoners were freaked out, as understandably, because the town was flooding. And in some cases, the water came up to their chests, their necks, and they were worried, this is it. We're going to drown. They've literally left us to die. So this is an example of how certain categories of people are viewed as expendable, right? Surplus. They don't matter. We can leave them to die. The toxic soup that these prisoners were nearly drowning in was the result of the fact that this is Texas after all, where climate denial comes with the territory. So does the oil industry. We had an enormous amount of hydrocarbons in that water because of the high density of the petrochemical industry nearby that had been for decades having chemical leaks, accidents, and spills that when that 35 inches of rain hit, just became a toxic soup, thus further threatening not only the health of the prisoners, but the health of people in the city of Beaumont. Climate change, prisoners. Texas is also hot as hell. Over the last 20 years, we have seen literally dozens of people incarcerated in Texas prisoners die or nearly die from heat-related complications, and they have been bringing lawsuits and have been winning those lawsuits for basic human rights of having heat relief. This is going to hit home like nothing else, right? Southern California once again is on fire. This is the reality of anthropogenic, that is to say human-caused climate change in the 21st century. And this is our reality. Many of you may know that nearly at least 33% of our firefighting workforce, the good men and women and youth, that hasn't been reported very much, of the firefighting force in the state of California are imprisoned individuals who, in my humble opinion, cannot in any way offer full informed consent. But this is the story we've been told, and they are doing a hell of a job putting their lives at risk to fight these intensely amplified wildfires over the last couple of years. And so we are seeing these folks out on the front lines this week. And so this is a problem, again, connecting climate change to people who are legally enslaved and being essentially forced to do this work. So I mentioned that I'm very much interested in history, so let's talk about temporality. I spent 7 years in the great state of Minnesota, known to the Dakota people as Minnesota Makoche, the land where the water meets the sky. This is a photo of the concentration camp known as Fort Snelling. You can take a field trip there, go on a picnic. It's great, except in 1862 and after that, it was a concentration camp for those hostiles, Dakota people who only wanted their land and be able to live their lives. The federal government decided that they were in the way, and so they rounded them up in this concentration camp, and illness, mass starvation, and death ensued. For those of you who are interested in gory topics such as lynching and mass hangings, this was the site of the single largest mass hanging in U.S. history. 38 Dakota resistors, some would call them patriots, who were resisting colonization, were hanged at a single moment on a scaffolding, on the gallows in this concentration camp. Just a quick note, just to clarify. I use the term concentration camps, as do other legal scholars and historians, because the definition of concentration camp is a site of imprisonment for who you are, for an identity that you occupy, not for any crime that you have allegedly committed. So in the Nazi-led Holocaust, those were certainly concentration camps, but more to the point, those were death camps. So let's get clear about that. I want to just make sure that people understand that I'm not appropriating language, that this applies across a number of contexts. Continuing with temporality in history, many of us are aware of the 13th Amendment, the evidence in black and white that we never actually fully abolished slavery in the United States. It is still legal, juridically constitutional, to enslave human beings in this country as punishment for a crime. Check out Ava DuVernay's wonderful documentary, 13th. Here's an example of that with a twist. Everybody has read about convict leasing, this system of enslavement that followed the end of formal chattel enslavement in the United States, where governments across this country were loaning out human beings to corporations to do all manner of work. I have this example here. It's relevant to a lecture on environmental justice because these black enslaved human beings being loaned out from the government in Tennessee to the Tennessee Iron and Coal Company. So these folks were enslaved human beings whose job it was to engage in activity that ultimately furthered anthropogenic climate change. So we've got climate injustice, environmental injustice, and enslavement. Let me know if I'm going too slow. All right. Moving merrily along through U.S. history, a number of friends of mine were interned, incarcerated during World War II when FDR said Japanese Americans are a threat, or potential threat. They may be too loyal they may be more loyal to the Emperor of Japan than they are to the United States, a claim, a fear that was not proven at all. These folks, 120,000 of them more or less, were thrown in concentration camps, and these were concentration camps because they were thrown in there because of their identity, not because of anything they did. And this is an environmental injustice. A number of scholars are starting to look at this because a whole host of health problems resulted. Many women in these concentration camps had stillbirths. skyrocketing rates of birth complications. People were facing dehydration, starvation, valley fever, which is a fungal disease, because most of these concentration camps were in the western United States, where we can be susceptible to the fungus that leads to valley fever. But for me, most interesting from an environmental justice perspective is that the water systems in many of these concentration camps was constructed based on pipes and storage materials that had previously been used by the US military to store oil. So there were oil traces, laces, and hydrocarbons in the water system, placing Japanese Americans' health at further risk. So, talked about the first two pillars of critical environmental justice, talking about these various categories of difference, how they all intersect, how at any one site, if you were just saying, oh, there's an environmental justice situation going down in South LA, and it's all about racism, or it's all about class and income, likely not the case. Take a closer look and you will see that there are various nuances and layers and slices of humanity who are entangled in these conflicts, and that might sound unfortunate, it certainly is, but it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity for reaching out and expanding the base, broadening the tent, and building coalitions that are truly diverse and beautiful so that we can imagine and bring into existence a different world, a world otherwise. So let's move on to pillars 3 and 4. As I mentioned before, I'm interested in questioning state-centric analyses of environmental injustice that say, you know what, we got a problem. The solution is the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. They'll solve it for us. Has anybody heard of the U.S. EPA? That was an agency long ago that maybe we'll bring it back some point after 2020, perhaps. So let's be critical of that. And by the way, that's not just me sort of talking off the cuff and bad-mouthing the US EPA. You may be interested to know that in the last 30 years, the US EPA's Office of Civil Rights, which is tasked with actually investigating civil rights violations in the form of environmental racism, has this many times issued a formal notice of violation, a formal finding of a civil rights violation, despite the fact that there are scores, hundreds of examples of rampant environmental racism in this country. The US EPA, in Democratic and Republican administrations, has found not a single formal violation of any human being's civil rights. Shameful. Shameful. Jill Lindsay Harrison, a sociologist at the University of Colorado, this month is releasing a book where she interviewed literally dozens, if not hundreds, of US EPA employees and finds rampant racism inside that agency and rampant examples of how people are minimizing environmental justice struggles and not doing the job of furthering the policy agenda of environmental justice. So this is not just happening out there in corporations and other government agencies. This is happening in the agency who is tasked with delivering environmental justice. It's a real problem. The pillars 3 and 4 are, much of this is embedded in resistance movements in prisons and there's allies on the outside, and so I want to talk about that now. Here's a laundry list, but not a complete list, a laundry list of just some examples of the kinds of demands, the kinds of visions of change that prisoners in this country have put forth. Engaging in hunger strikes and labor strikes, I've mentioned that before. Commissary strikes. If you're a fan of Orange is the New Black, you know what the commissary is, right? It's the store, right? We're not going to buy from the store anymore until y'all start treating us right. Lawsuits, demanding clean water, demanding access to showers. Governor Jerry Brown totally said that prisons in California during the height of the drought could limit access to showers, like maybe once or twice a week. Prisoners are like, nah, we're not taking that. We're going to fight back. And they won. Demanding healthy food, demanding health care. Can you imagine that? And for me as an educator, most exciting is I have seen an enormous volume of stories where prisoners are saying, you know what the most important thing we want in this joint? We want education. We want curricular changes. We demand women's studies, ethnic studies, sociology, environmental studies, insurgent disciplines, because we want to learn more about the conditions of confinement that we are experiencing, and we'd like to make a change. And as you can imagine, that's not the most popular item on the menu, and many prisoners have been repressed for that. One person whom I've met personally, Eddie Zhang, a Chinese-American prisoner, was thrown into the hole, the shoe, the solitary confinement at San Quentin Prison for 11 months because he wanted one thing, Asian American Studies. And he was willing to teach the class, willing to contact professors at area universities in California to come in and teach that class mobilize the resources, and he is now out of prison and is a leader of a group called the Asian Prisoner Support Committee that works on behalf of prisoners in the system, and has successfully gotten ethnic studies curriculum introduced not only in San Quentin but in a number of prisons across the state. So don't ever let anybody tell you that reading a book is somehow not dangerous. Continuing on with the resistance theme, these two gentlemen are perhaps the most famous political prisoners in the world, certainly in the United States. On your left, we have Leonard Peltier, and on your right, we have Mumia Abu-Jamal, both serving life sentences, death row, for alleged crimes they committed in the name of American Indian movement, indigenous liberation, and black liberation. Well, they are relevant to this talk because they have both been leaders in the prison-based environmental justice movement. Leonard Peltier, since the 70s, has been talking about the ways in which indigenous peoples have been siphoned off of their land onto reservations that themselves are often toxic, and then siphoned, like he was, off into the prison system to neutralize the activism of indigenous folks like himself, who's an American Indian movement activist, so that to make way for and to facilitate access for corporations, for resource extraction activity, for government agencies to go in and develop native lands, and to do so cheaply. Mumia Abu-Jamal, I found an essay from 1989 when he was serving time on death row at a prison in Pennsylvania, where he was writing about widespread water contamination at his prison and at prisons all across the country. And one of those powerful things he said in that essay was, those of you who are allegedly free, or as he likes to say, the not yet caged, you think you're free and you think that your water is pure and uncontaminated. But in so many cases, the same water system that he is drinking from that is contaminated is the same water system that we are drinking from. So you're saying, if you don't care about prisoners, if you only care about yourself, that this is still a legit issue. Allies on the outside continue to do good work, working on behalf of prisoners and bringing together this issue of environmental justice. Madres del Este de Los Angeles, Mothers of East LA, also known as MELA, has been doing this work since the early 1980s, back when Governor Duke Majan was around. They worked to stop incinerators, oil pipelines, and prisons in LA and other parts of California. Critical Resistance, a group that's still around today, brought lawsuits against prisons and prison proposals in the state of California on behalf not only of prisoners, but on behalf of ecosystems that were going to be affected. The Tipton kangaroo rat is one of my favorite examples of a being whom this initiative was advocating on behalf of. Everybody's heard of the Flint water crisis? Lead poisoning crisis? See a show of hands. Anybody heard of Flint water crisis? Okay. Is that crisis over with? Are we done with that? Is the water clean? Right. Good. Well-informed people. It continues, just as the lead poisoning crisis in Newark, New Jersey continues. This water is a human right projection was done by the Detroit Light Brigade, an activist group, in February of 2016 to make the point that water is a human right. Genessee is the county in which Flint, Michigan is based. This is the county jail where prisoners there were told by corrections officers during the lead poisoning crisis, which is now, you have two choices. You can either drink lead-contaminated water, and by the way, the water the corrections officers was drinking was bottled and pured and filtered, or you can drink no water at all. Many of the prisoners in that jail at the time were women, some of whom were actually pregnant. So they had a very difficult choice. The movement continues. It's a national and global movement. As I said, I'm part of a group called the Campaign to Fight Toxic Prisons. I'll talk about that in Q&A if you like. But, as an environmental justice scholar, EJ scholar, I've asked myself, why am I so fixated on prisons at this moment? What does that actually do for me as a scholar? What does that do for rethinking the issues of environmental justice? Well, as I mentioned, I'm very much interested in pushing the envelope beyond this idea that the government will solve all of our problems. And there's where actually, on a surprising note, maybe not, I have conservatives who come up to me like, yeah, I really like that point. Like, good, we can talk about that. Very much interested in pushing environmental justice solutions beyond the typical reformist orientation that we see in both the literature and in the movement. The government is not going to solve this problem. The government can be a part of the solution, but it's not going to be the sole site of resolution. Working in prisons, dealing with people who are entangled in the legal, juridically, constitutionally normalized human enslavement and brutality, these folks are saying we have got to move beyond reform, David. This system is corrupt at its core. The whole damn system is racist as hell. We've got to move beyond reform. Another reason why environmental justice in prisons is an exciting place for me. As I mentioned earlier, one of the single most important, if not single most important, lasting and enduring and significant contributions of the movement for environmental justice and the field for environmental justice studies is redefining what we even mean by the environment. Again, it's not just the flora and the fauna, it's not just the forests, it's not just the oceans and the rivers. It is that. But it's also those spaces where human beings live, work, play, learn, and pray. In other words, every place that we inhabit, everything that we do is part of the environment. And that allows us to think, okay, then maybe I'm an environmentalist even though I'm working on housing justice. Maybe I'm an environmentalist even though I'm working on human rights. Maybe I'm an environmentalist and I'm working on civil rights and gender justice, immigrant justice. You are, even if you don't know it, because these things are all intertwined. And every one of these things we do, people in prison do those as well. So maybe we need to expand the notion of our notion of the environment as not just places where we live, work, learn, play, and pray, but also places where we do time. Prisons are an extraordinary site of environmental justice struggles. I'm also interested as a scholar in pushing back against what I think are really bad ideas that have very little empirical support for them. One of them is this, the minority move-in hypothesis, something that lets a lot of people sleep at night because it's another myth. We love myths in this country. This is the myth. Environmental racism, that is the very, very strong spatial correlation between being a person of color in the United States and living in a toxic, chemically laden, poisonous community, is not the fault of the government. And it's certainly not the fault of corporate America. Nobody's targeting these people. It is all about the market. It's all about class, income. People of color are moving into contaminated and polluted neighborhoods. That's what's going on. Yeah, nobody's targeting them. It's just about low rent values. People are making economically rational decisions, right? Cost of living is cheaper over here in this polluted community. Let me get my ass over here. Yeah, sleep well, except that isn't the case more than maybe this percentage of time. The vast majority of cases of environmental racism, according to scholars like Paul Mohai, Robin Saha, and many others, actually are the result of industry, corporate America, polluting facilities, targeting, zeroing in on people of color, understanding that these folks are valued less, that their voices matter less, that they tend to vote less, that they are expendable. Vast majority of the cases of environmental racism follow that pattern. Sleep well tonight. The minority hypothesis is moot. It is most certainly moot if you are in a situation where you have no mobility, where you have no leverage over where you're going to be living tomorrow or next year because you're a prisoner. You might be a prisoner in the Northwest Detention Center, which is smack dab next to a federally designated toxic Superfund site. So this myth that somehow people have free will and choice and can move from one place to another, it's all about economics. We need to put that to rest. Prisons and environmental justice do that for me. As I think I've amply demonstrated to you today, some of the most exciting leaders in the environmental justice movement in the United States are themselves incarcerated, enslaved, imprisoned. And for me, if these folks are actually in a situation of legal enslavement and they are engaging in resistance, I don't want to get too romantic, but this is a slave rebellion. And I want to urge you, I want to beseech you, I implore you to join this slave rebellion. These folks are asking for your allyship, for your assistance, for your help, not your charity, but for your solidarity. It's a slave rebellion, and we should think of it that way. For me, that's very exciting because then that puts the environmental justice movement in a much more exciting, radical, transformative context of the centuries-old abolitionist movement in the United States and worldwide. That is a radical way to rethink this movement. And I didn't come up with that. I just listened to people who told me, yeah, David, this is what's happening. So, from settler colonialism to abolition, bring this back to these key concepts. As I've said, settler colonialism and the U.S. prison system are, in my view, rooted in mutually reinforcing brutal hierarchies. Hierarchies that are not only intra-species, that is human on human, but intra-species. Examples of how humans dominate non-human environments, flora and fauna. So a critical environmental justice perspective, in my view, contends that these systems are rotten. They must go, they must be abolished. Now, what does that mean? Well, I look to critical geographers like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who, and this quote from 2014 says, abolition, I'm just going to read it, abolition is a movement. It is a movement to end systemic violence, including interpersonal vulnerabilities and displacements that really fuel this system, that keep this system going. In other words, the goal of abolition, the goal of prison abolition, and I am an abolitionist, is to change how we interact with one another and our planet by putting people before profits, welfare before warfare, and life over death. So I'm an abolitionist, and I'm somebody who believes that we need to take the idea of state-centric analyses seriously, so much so that I am influenced by anarchist theory and practice. And this, again, is a place where I have really wonderful, fun, and productive conversations with conservatives who's like, oh yeah, I'm an anarchist as well, or a libertarian. That's great, let's talk about that. I can get down with that. That's a conversation we can have in polarized America. It's not so much about taking a sledgehammer or a jackhammer to the government or to prisons, but because that's easy. What's hard, the more difficult work, is trying to build peaceful, socially equitable, and respectful relationships and institutions that will make the prison system itself obsolete, irrelevant, and past tense. Things that governments have a very hard time doing. Non-militarized peace, non-militarized socially just relationships and ecological sustainability. So I want to end with a story. This is Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Anybody heard of Fort Sill? All right. And a couple of people. Like Fort Snelling, this is a museum, bookshop. You can take a field trip, hang out, have lunch, learn a little bit about history. It's just north of Lawton, Oklahoma. Fort Sill, however, in 1894 was a concentration camp. It's a concentration camp, again, for those hostiles, the Native Americans who were resisting colonization, conquest, and genocide, including this guy, Geronimo. Chiricahua Apache, him and some 41 other compatriots imprisoned there until the day they died. Prisoners of war. It's a concentration camp. Fort Sill, Oklahoma was also an Indian boarding school. People have heard of boarding schools? Right, where children were forcibly separated from their families. Does that have an echo of the present? Forcibly separated from their families. Native children brought into this concentration camp and under the rubric, the ideology of save the child, kill the Indian, indoctrinated in Western Anglo-Saxon cultural ways. What Lakota scholar James Fenelon calls cultural genocide, culturicide, killing someone's culture. That was officially the goal. And it worked in some cases. So it was a boarding school and a concentration camp. It was also around the same time the site of the U.S. Army's 10th Cavalry Regiment. Buffalo soldiers, African Americans, whose job it was to help quell the righteous and legitimate and loving rebellions of indigenous peoples and to support American empire, white supremacy, and empire. I, as an African American, take no pride in knowing that black folks did that. Buffalo soldiers. Moving on merrily through the annals of American history. World War II, I talked about the Japanese-American mass incarceration. Fort Sill. 700 Japanese Americans incarcerated in this concentration camp because they were deemed as a threat to national security. That's World War II. Moving merrily on. 2014, under the Obama administration, some 1,800 immigrant children forcibly separated from their families, were placed here at Fort Sill. There was an outcry, an uprising. They were moved out, but not before they had been exposed to a whole cocktail of chemicals that have been used on that site, including trihalomethanes, chloramines, and others, which can cause cancer, anemia, DNA mutations, and all sorts of other things. That was 2014. Fast forward to June of 2019. Under the Trump regime, 1,800 children were being proposed, immigrant children, also forcibly removed and separated from their families, to be sent to this site. 1,800 children. Well, in June and July of this year, indigenous peoples and Japanese Americans who themselves were survivors of the World War II incarceration in this concentration camp said, hell no, enough is enough. Let us shut down this concentration camp and do something beautiful and powerful and inspiring with this site of such tragedies in human history. So I bring this last example up to say a couple of things. That prisons and imprisonment, if we take a close look, are often multi-layered sites of struggles for environmental justice, multi-layered sites that reveal not only human caging, but beautiful struggles. Beautiful struggles like this one. Folks showing up in solidarity for other folks who may not look like them, who may not be from their communities, but showing up to show that, in my view, environmental justice struggles can have enormously transformative potential when they are looking at the roots of the problem, the driving forces of the problem, the conditions that facilitate environmental racism, and when they decide that settler colonialism must be confronted and reckoned with. And so I salute these folks for doing that, for engaging in deeply intersectional, radical social justice work. And I thank you for listening to me, and I look forward to your comments and questions. I'm done.